We are pleased to welcome author Lisa A. Phillips, Professor Lisa A. Phillips. She's a journalism professor at SUNY New Paltz. She's the author of a book called Unrequited, The Thinking Woman's Guide to Romantic Obsession. Lisa, welcome. How are you?
I'm well, thank you so much.
So we're glad to have you. And one of the things that strikes me about this book, right off the bat, is that you're speaking to women here. And we know that men go through severe heartbreak as well. My first question to you is, can a man read this book and find it interesting?
I think a man can read this book and find it interesting. If I could take a moment just to say why I chose to focus on women, because certainly there are men in my life who have confided in me pretty serious cases of unrequited love. It was a decision of focus. It was a decision because I think women, the expectation in society is pretty heavy on them to be very efficient and effective and alluring in matters of love and not get hung up on a guy who's just not that into him. And there's a lot of pressure on women. And I think the taboo of the crazy ex-girlfriend is a pretty intense one right now for women. So this was a book focusing on them, but it's not to say that men don't suffer from unrequited love and that they wouldn't get anything out of the book.
Now, you wrote the book because of your own personal experience. You went through a severe obsession with someone who was an intimate partner in your life. Can you tell us about first of all, what happened back then? And then, of course, what brought you to writing about it?
I can certainly discuss that. First of all, just a little bit of perspective. I'm 47 now. This happened the year I turned 30. So this was quite a long time ago. And this was someone actually, it's funny because people will refer to the man in the book I call B as my ex. And I'm a little hesitant to embrace that particular honorific for him because we were never a couple. He was someone that I was friends with. We were close. We flirted. We had a couple of intimate encounters, but we were never together as a couple. But he was someone I wanted to be with very badly. And he hinted that perhaps he'd want that too. He was involved with someone else. And so I hung on. I stood by calmly at first. And then when he didn't break up with the woman that he was seeing, as he had said he planned to, after a while, I started getting really, really obsessed with him. I couldn't think of anything else. It was affecting my functioning. A lot of the things that you describe on the Exaholics website, I definitely went through. And I eventually started to act out. And at one point, when we went through a couple of rounds of, he'd see his girlfriend, this was a long distance relationship, and he'd say he was going to break up with her, and then she'd leave, and then he'd say, well, no, it actually didn't happen. And so there were a couple of rounds of that, and I think after the second or third one, I just became very righteous, and I thought, this is wrong. He says he doesn't want to be with her, yet he stays with her. And I just woke up one morning, and it was early in the morning, and I marched to his apartment, got someone to let me in the security door, and I went up and banged on his door until he let me in. And instead of greeting me with expressions of love and thank goodness you're here, he had a baseball bat in his hand, and in one hand and the phone in the other, and he was calling 911. And so I was really, I would say I was surprised. I was surprised. But I think that was a moment that I look back on as a reckoning of like, okay, something went badly awry, and I became aggressive in a way that I wish I hadn't. And that, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You say that you were surprised, and you had two really interesting things to be surprised by. One is a baseball bat in his hand, and the other a threat to call 911. Mm-hmm. What was the relationship like up until that point? Was there friction leading up to that day?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of tension because it was one of those situations where he was confused. He was with someone else, and he was, I think, ambivalent, or so he said, about being with her, and he was ambivalent about being with me because he couldn't leave her to be with me, even though he said he was going to. I think this is probably a familiar story to many of your members. And that was very frustrating to me because I was reading the signs that said, to me, we're meant for each other. This needs to happen. I love him. But all these things that I thought would come to pass were not coming to pass. So I was incredibly frustrated and upset and obsessed.
You know, interestingly enough, we have a lot of books that are written by professionals about this issue, breakups, relationships, etc. But it adds a certain authenticity to the book to have it written by someone who's experienced it herself and is and is open about it. Um, you're open about it now. Do you still recognize the person that you were back then?
Hmm. Um, That's a really good question. I do, and I do in some interesting ways. I don't fall obsessively in love anymore. I'm very happily married, and it's a very, we've been married for 14 years almost, and so we're in a very contented place. We know each other well. I don't get crushes on people outside the marriage, and I don't get obsessed with people. There are things that I recognize, though. And this is the more complex part of my message, I think, perhaps for your membership, um, which is that I think that there are some upsides or benefits, shall we say, to obsessive unrequited love, and to, I think maybe in this case, I think it's to being a person who is driven. I channeled it in the wrong direction back then, but I think that feeling of conquest, of I've got to get it done, is still very much a part of me. And it doesn't work when you're dealing with unrequited love and someone who's just not able, for whatever reason, to be with you and reciprocate. But it can work if you can channel it in other directions in your life. When you could take that determination and move it toward other goals. Having that side of you that's sensitive, that really wants something badly, can be turned in other directions.
Now, in the book, you talk to a number of women, in the hundreds, I think, hundreds of stories, and it's all women, I believe. Is that right?
Well, what I do is I ran a survey and I gathered information on a couple hundred people who filled out the survey. The in-depth interviews were around 30, just basically because of the limits of the book. You can't really get more than 3 stories into a chapter or so. And most of those were women. I did also interview men who were the targets of a woman's obsession because I felt like that perspective was very important for the book.
What are some of the other threads that you saw in these stories? Was there a commonality in all of them, or were they all distinct?
I think they were all united really just by the theme of the book, which is romantic obsession. These were stories of women who at a certain juncture in this relationship they had, or rather didn't have with someone, they just couldn't think of anything else. And it just felt like this force in their life that was driving them instead of something that they could have some control over. I get asked a lot about what causes this, and I don't think there's a kind of one-size-fits-all explanation. I think that there is this dynamic that happens that can be applied to a range of life stories and life histories, which is, again, this idea that you are taking a person and the goal of the relationship with the person, which is essentially what we could call a lower order goal. And that, you could say, I want to find love and happiness with person X, but you really want that love and happiness of an enduring partnership in the end if that person's not really there for you. And presumably someone else who is compatible with you could fill that role just as well. So a lower order goal is when there's something substitutable about it. But the higher order goal is that goal of lasting love and partnership with a particular person, which is not a goal you can replace with something else. That's the important thing. So there's this kind of thing that gets all tied up, and it's this web where person X has to be that he is the only one who can bring that future of happiness with a committed partner. And so I think that dynamic is something where, you know, the person that the women I spoke with, the people they were obsessed with, were singular. They felt irreplaceable. They felt like there could be no one else in the world who could fulfill that exact function. So those were some of the things that drew them together. And then as far as the causes, they varied widely. It could be, you know, some of the familiar concepts that I worked with are things such as attachment theory, where when you do not have secure caretaking in your earliest days, weeks, months, years, that can often create a template for later relationships. And that is an incredibly important factor in both the tendency to fall in unrequited love and the tendency to aggressively pursue stalking, or what I call soft stalking, which is not criminal stalking, but it's still that sort of inappropriate level of pursuit. And then there are things like transference, that there's some early relationship where you are trying to work something out about that early relationship with your current relationships, or again, your failure to have the relationship with someone else. So there are a number of factors.
We're talking to the author of Unrequited, The Thinking Woman's Guide to Romantic Obsession. Lisa Phillips is her name, and she's a journalism professor at SUNY New Paltz. And she's also the author of Public Radio Behind the Voices, just while we're on the topic of your work. Her articles have appeared in many national publications, including the New York Times, Psychology Today, Cosmopolitan, Salon, the Washington Post, and Boston Globe. She's a former radio journalist. She's contributed stories to NPR and other public radio outlets. Can I ask you this? Can this happen to anyone regardless of your background, culture, nationality, religion, race, economic position, social strata?
I think that it could. One of the things that the research indicates is that even though probably attachment issues are the most prominent in terms of what's been studied, there's also this other thing that goes on, which is when the level of distress or importance you place on the person is really, really high, that can be a factor in creating unrequited love. So presumably anybody, you know, someone could walk into the room, they place that degree of importance on them, and suddenly they become that, you know, irreplaceable person that even if they're not responding to your attention or your efforts, will be someone that you feel really pulled toward no matter what. But that theory has not been tested. I think that, you know, some people will say to me, this has never happened to me. Does that mean it will never? I don't know. But I think it could happen to most of us. And research shows that it has in some form happened to most of us.
Want to welcome members. MEH 0624, Holly 1403, Flannel 101, Flannel 01, Maria V2, Dylan, X Manias, MSL 77, Feeling the Blue, Patty IZ, and everyone else who's coming in and out. Flannel has a question. She asks, how do you relieve the feeling that person X is the only way to happiness? So, and I do want to remind everyone that Lisa's here to talk about her book and the research that she's picked up and the stories that she's collected in this fabulous book called Unrequited. Did you find that, and I think you just kind of alluded to that, this sense that there's a tremendous value placed on this one person, and we often hear from people, and I wonder if you felt this way back in the day in your situation that you had, was it almost 20 years ago? Did you notice this sense that, hey, only this person can bring me the happiness I need, that they really focused on that one person and really disregarded the logic that there may be others?
Yeah, I think that absolutely it felt that way. I did feel that the person I call B in the book was the last person on earth that I could be with. And that seems, profoundly off base when I think about it now, because that wasn't the case. So this question of how to relieve the feelings, how to get away from the feelings, that's really tough. And I spent the last chapter of my book, I talked to a number of psychologists and experts about how to make this dynamic end. And I think that there are some ways that it ends organically. Sometimes when the person just doesn't pay you any mind, as they say, you just get to this point of what's called starvation. There's nothing feeding this feeling. And so eventually it just goes away. You have nothing to go by. And if that's happening, you're probably one of the luckier ones. I think usually in these situations, there's something, if it's a work relationship, a friendship, someone you know on social media, there's something that keeps feeding the feeling, some kind of stimulation, some kind of message, some sense of, even if it's only a friendly nod from that person, you're going to have that confirmation bias of thinking, oh, maybe there's some hope now. Maybe he or she will pay attention to me. So you have to take it upon yourself, and this is really hard, I know it's really hard, to cut off contact in as much as you possibly can. If the person's in your life in a regular way, in a way that you can't escape, like a coworker type relationship, that's probably the hardest situation. But as much as possible, you have to just say, okay, no social media connections, no photos, no phone calls, no walks in the park, no platonic going to the movies, just nothing. Because usually if you really want to get rid of the feeling, you're at the point where it's too painful for you. There's no fun in it anymore. There's no intrigue. It's just pain. And so you have to really make as clean a break as possible. Even if you're afraid of hurting the person's feelings, you in a way, you kind of can't be. This is about saving yourself. And this is also about giving up hope that something's really going to happen with the person. A lot of times people will say, oh, he's my friend, how can I just cut him off like that? When in fact, the issue is that they really want that friendship to turn into a romance, and that's why they don't want to cut it off. But if it's becoming painful, you just have to do that. And there's some good techniques for that, for just simply realizing that you're going to feel grief, you're going to miss the person, you're going to have to get used to sitting with painful feelings, which is something that when I think about my situation, I don't think I was up for doing at all. It felt so much better to send another email, go out and look for him, call him, chase him, than it did to actually sit with the misery of, my God, this person's so uncertain. This isn't right. This isn't going to happen. It's hard work.
Chapter 5, entitled Falling from the Stars, Losing Yourself to the Narcissism of Unrequited Love. What is the narcissism of unrequited love?
This is a great question. Some people take a lot of issue with the fact that I work with narcissism in this way and write about narcissism in this way, because we usually think of narcissists as those vain people who are constantly using other people. And people who are in obsessive unrequited love often feel used. They feel like, okay, how come he or she isn't paying attention to me? They give me these little tidbits and never come through. But what puts both kinds of narcissism in the same camp, so to speak, is that both ways use another person to complete the self. And you must have that other person to complete the self. So even though the unrequited love narcissism is a more overtly needy narcissism, it's still, again, using that person in an unhealthy way. Like, I need this person to feel like myself or to complete myself. And I don't care truly where that other person's at. Because if I cared, I would see that that person is confused and or doesn't want me.
But there's also that feeling
Mm-hmm.
that of almost being tricked or bait and switched, where those feelings and attentiveness and adoration came from the narcissist on the other side and led you in, and to the point where you're sort of hooked, and you bought it hook, line, and sinker, and now the tables have turned and you have to deal with that feeling.
Yeah, I think in the end, sure, that can happen. Narcissists do that. People who are just human and confused do that too. They think they want to be with you, then they can't make it happen for whatever reason, other relationships, etc. And I think one of the strong messages of my book Unrequited is that no matter what, you can't be thinking about what's wrong with the other person and what's preventing them from being with you. You have to face the fact of they can't do it. They can't do it right now. This is what I'm stuck with. And it may be because they're completely broken, but you're not going to be the one to fix them, to diagnose them, to analyze them. You're just faced with the fact that the person can't come through for you, and it hurts and it sucks. So you have to look at yourself and why you're hanging on, instead of thinking, oh, he's a narcissist. He's put me in this situation. You could say, oh, he's a narcissist. You can say all those things. He's a narcissist. He's put me in this situation, but now I have to deal with it. And why am I still hanging on?
At some point, Lisa, the focus, I guess what you're saying is, at some point, the focus has to shift to ourselves.
Yeah, and the sooner the better. People in unrequited love, and I was one of them, will go on and on and on. And I say this in the spirit of support, not criticism. On and on and on, analyzing the other person. That's really what they prefer to do. Because there's that sense of, if you figure them out, everything will be okay. But that's not how it works. You're still stuck with this person who's not reciprocating or can't be with you for some reason. Yeah.
We had a speaker recently who I thought was extraordinarily interesting, who said that oftentimes, and I wonder if you saw this in any of the interviews that you did with the women who were in unrequited love situations, that many of us, when we get into relationships, we may not like ourselves. Those of us who become obsessed may not like ourselves all that much. And it's the adoration and the admiration of this particular person that triggers this newfound self-respect, self-adoration, and actually comfort with oneself through the eyes of this other person. And that's what is so addictive. It's, if you walk into a relationship feeling insecure, and suddenly that is made up for by the security being given by the other person in this relationship, that's the hook.
Yeah, and I think for some of the people in my book, they may have had that once, because there once was a relationship, or at least they felt like they had that person's adoration made them feel right about themselves. But for a number of women in my book, and to some degree for myself, that relationship never fully existed. It just someone that they're really longing for, and who for some reason they think will see them that way. That's very compelling. I mean, I remember in my case, the man I loved, in the beginning of our friendship, we had, tremendous mutual respect. I knew what he thought of me. And I knew that at one point he desired me and admired me, but that point had ended, or at least it was, maybe he still felt it to some degree. I have no idea, but he couldn't show it. It became impossible. And so, yes, it is something very tricky to invest that much in someone. In real mutual love, you do get a lot of support for the other person, and it does feel good to feel their love and admiration. But there's something wrong when you're investing all that in someone who is not, and really has, in some cases has never been able to supply true support.
The Washington Post calls Unrequited an ingenious hybrid of memoir, case study, scientific inquiry, and intellectual history, not only of unrequited love, but of love, full stop, with a capital L. We're talking to Lisa Phillips. Let's move away from unrequited love for a moment, because you went on and you got married, and in a successful marriage. What have you learned, or have you learned a lot about love itself, given your own evolving experience?
Well, one of the things, I met my husband pretty soon after this explosive unrequited love struck my life, and I think that that's important. It's at times I feel funny about it, because that's not really supposed to happen. You're not really supposed to go for the rebound guy and marry him, but I did. But I think that one of the things I write about unrequited love is that it can really be a turning point for a lot of people. It gives them a shove away from something they've been stuck in and into something they need to confront, a place in their lives they need to be. Sometimes people make really radical changes in the wake of unrequited love. They move, they change careers, their career takes off, they have, in one case in my book, it was a turning point for a new realization about the woman's sexual orientation. Big things happen around unrequited love. And for me, there was this point where I was driven so low that I just thought, you know what? This can't happen anymore. I can only be with someone who is good to me. It's like this very basic decision that I'd never made before in my life. I'd never actually said that to myself. I, easily gave myself to people or relationships that weren't very healthy and weren't fundamentally supportive. And so I made that decision. And when I met my husband, that was really the bar, the line in the sand. And he happened to be somebody who that was not a problem for him. He was clear. He could be good to me. And I think that those basic things, the kind of root of the relationship, is not about the person that you would, how can I put it? Passion is amazing. It's wonderful. It's an essential part of life, but it's also, new love has it right at the beginning, but that's not necessarily what makes love last. I mean, these are very, very simple things that I'm saying, but they're important to reinforce, especially for, I think, the exaholic community, where there's probably a lot of feeling of, sadness and loss about these things, and a feeling, I remember how I felt, that this stuff just can't happen. But you want someone who doesn't drive you crazy, who makes you feel steady ultimately, and calm, and more yourself, as opposed to transformed by passion and the kinds of things that passion is going to make you become, and the glow of feeling desired, and all of those things that can be so compelling in rockier relationships.
Holly 1403 says, "Hello, Lisa. Nice to meet you. I was told I pedestal my ex. I resisted that with my lovely counselor. I now know I did, and learned why. I am an emotionally better person for that. Do you think that it's common for one partner to pedestal the other?" So she's talking about putting that person on a pedestal. I'm sure you ran into that in your work.
Yeah, it's about what you project onto the person, the ideals and ideas that you project onto them. And certainly putting them at a higher level than yourself can be a part of that. Maybe you're hoping that person will lift you up. Maybe there's some part of you doesn't feel up to the same level. Absolutely, that can be part of the dynamic, deeply idealizing someone else. I'm glad you've been able to move away from that. I think that's fantastic.
Flannel01 says, "You've been giving great advice. I know my monthly-ish check-ins on my ex's Facebook was painful and brought back all the horrible feelings, but I can see now it is feeding my obsession. I realize now a lot of social media posts are actually in hope he will see it. I think I will take a big break on social media. Thank you, thank you. Social media is a big part of it. Do you think, and let's just talk about some of the developments in social media. Facebook now has a feature that can keep your ex out of your social media life. Good for Facebook. And I think it's going to help a lot of people. But there are also more people dating now, just in general. And because more people are dating because of social media and Tinder and the like, there are also more breakups than ever before. Would you say that this breakup experience, and I have a couple of questions on this, but first, do you think that we could call it something like an epidemic?
Breaking up is an epidemic?
The breakup pain, and just the sheer prevalence of the breakup pain that people are feeling because relationships now just come and go in the swipe dating culture that we're in today.
Yeah, I think there's a real catch-22 going on, and I think it's very insidious and very difficult. I often thank my stars that I am not, I didn't come of age in the social media era, though I'm raising a daughter who definitely is. I think it would have been very difficult with my emotional makeup to navigate those waters. So what social media does, and this is very powerful, is it creates desire constantly. And it creates the weak reinforcement of little stuff, like little texts, Snapchats, posts, signs, things that are like little bits of, little snacks, little bits of candy that keep you feeling like there might be something out there. Like, oh, did he post that because he knows I like this band and now he's posting a video of it? Is he sending a sign to me? It creates, again, just a desire and attachment, and it can feed obsession. But at the same time, exactly as you're saying, it creates this illusion of endless choice. You can always go on Tinder and see if you can match with some more people and see what possibilities there are there. There's always that feeling that there are endless fish in the sea. And I think what the research has shown is, in the face of too many choices, it doesn't make our lives better. It makes us less likely to choose. Literally, they've done this study on people in supermarkets faced with varieties of jam. When there are too many varieties of jam, you don't buy any jam. When there are fewer varieties, you will be more likely to buy. And I'm not comparing lovers or partners to jam. That would be trivializing it. But I do think there's something really rough about this combination of all this availability of signs and signals of potential desire and the illusion of endless choice and endless possibility. I think it messes with our heads, makes us hard to feel like, it makes us hard to see each other's dignity and humanity and each other's souls. It's dehumanizing.
The word trivializing, and when you use that word, it made me think of the way we trivialize breakups. First of all the platitudes. Go out and exercise and hang out with your friends more. Or even genuine sort of mocking of people who suffer from this breakup pain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that culture hasn't fully, our culture in media and elsewhere, and even in pop psychology, hasn't fully come to respect the pain and the difficulty that people go through?
I think it scares us. I think you're absolutely right. I think we don't want to truly face that pain, and so we mock it, we belittle it, we diminish it, we run away from it. We tell each other these things. I mean, it's actually a very good thing to hang out with your friends and exercise when you're obsessed with someone else. But you also can't overlook that other point, which is that someone who is obsessed with a lost lover, an unrequited love, or an ex is in deep grief. That this is serious. This is very serious, deep grief. And so you're telling them to exercise and hang out with their friends as just one little tool to give them a little bit of a break from their grief. But you can't just tell them that and ignore that there's grief happening and respect that there's grief happening. So yeah, I agree with you. Our culture, this is scary to us, especially now when we like to believe that we're moving so quickly and can do so many things at once, and we're always busy and we're always rushing. I think that we're getting less willing to accept the slower, deeper, more difficult side of our natures.
For the new members who've just joined us, the book is called Unrequited, The Thinking Woman's Guide to Romantic Obsession. Let me ask you this, back when you went through it,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of support did you have?
You know, I have to say, I was really embarrassed. And this is another reason I aim the book at women. I think for today's woman, you know, smart, feeling on equal playing field in many ways with men in the professional world, all these things, it seems like there's nothing that can hold a woman back, right? It can be a shameful thing to um, contend with feelings of obsession for another person, and particularly for a man. Though certainly I think what I discuss applies to same-sex situations as well. So I was really embarrassed. It's like, okay, look at me. I just finished my master's degree. I'm trying to build my career. I'm an accomplished person. I'm terribly, terribly embarrassed by these feelings. And I did have good, dear friends that I confided in. And they were very patient with me and listened to all my musings and crying and everything else that I did. But in the world, I think I felt like this was just something, how could I possibly be this person? How could this be happening to me? And I didn't know where to turn, I think, for real useful information and support. So I felt very alone and very embarrassed.
You know, humans are we're born into this world and we have drives and we have needs. One, you know, besides food and other and shelter and comfort and climate, we're also driven to connect, aren't we?
We are. And that's why this stuff really shouldn't be so embarrassing, is because the impulse behind it is profoundly human. You're just aiming it in the wrong direction. But it's still an incredibly painful thing. And we should be giving each other support in the way that we give each other support for other kinds of losses.
Holly says, "Oh my, OMG, so true. Could not agree more." Folks, we are reaching that time where we only have a few minutes left. So if you have any more questions, now's a good time uh, to type them in the box and hit send, and we will ask Lisa Phillips on your behalf. Um, Tell me this. I know you did some of the scientific study, or you covered some of the scientific study. What did you find in the world of science as relates to this?
Oh, well, I think that what seems pretty clear in the research into how our brains work is that love is an addiction. And this is, I don't credit this to my own research. This is taking from the groundbreaking work of Helen Fisher, the biological anthropologist at Rutgers University. And I will quote her. She says, "Love is an addiction. It's a great addiction when it's going well. It's a horrible addiction when it's not going well." And she's right. You know, just as you said, we are programmed to need each other, to seek each other in intimate relationships, and love is a drive. And that when we are in a situation where we're rejected, the brain is very cruel. It steps up the urge to attach, and it pushes the body into a protest response where it's like, no, this can't be happening. I'm even more in love. I can't lose this person. And so it pushes us to try to regain what we've lost. And so this is the fundamental condition of the abandoned lover. And it's really, really difficult. It's like other kinds of cravings, you know, for alcohol, if you're an alcoholic, for drugs, if you're a drug addict. And it's really difficult to work your way out of that.
Lionel says, thank you so much for answering my questions. I'll be purchasing your book and sharing it with friends. Ultimately, having done the work and written this fabulous book, what do you hope your readers will get out of it?
I've been so fortunate to have had deeply appreciative readers. I think what readers are going to get, you know, I'm not, you very accurately labeled me a journalist and a journalism professor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a storyteller. I'm a journalist. I write about my life and I go out and report, you know, report on the problem, so to speak. So what you're going to get is a helpful resource in some ways, but it's not a self-help book. What it is it's kind of a deep dive into the journey of unrequited love as a spectrum of experiences that range from things that just, you know, drive you crazy and distract you like a delightful crush to a really, really intense kind of scenario where you're the women in the book that I speak to are really doing things that break the law, that are very extreme and so forth. So you're going to get a sense of the range of experiences, and you're going to get a sense of how unrequited love functions in our culture. And I think what you're going to feel, especially if you're suffering from a breakup or obsessive unrequited love, is that you have company in the world, and that there are really important reasons why these things happen, and that they're important to listen to inside of yourself and in the broader culture. Where is this feeling pushing me to? How can I make use of it? Those are the kinds of questions my book asks. And I supply a number of examples from history and our present time of you know, women who were pushed in very revealing and meaningful directions.
You know, we always remind people that no, you're not crazy. There are forces at work, physiological and social and emotional, etc. And looking back, would you say that correct? You were not crazy.
No, I don't think I was crazy. I was obsessed, but I wasn't crazy. Yeah.
Holly 1403 says, you're amazing and so real the way you share your experience. I will be buying your book and sharing. Thank you again. We've learned a lot about you, Lisa, and your work and your story, and you've gotten to learn a little bit about us and what we do. What do you make of the fact that there's a opportunity here to connect with others going through a similar experience? Do you think you might have benefited from that 17 years ago?
Oh, without question. Without question. You know, as I said before, I really felt so alone. I mean, I think on some level, of course, I knew other people felt these ways, but I didn't know that other people felt just literally, you know, knocked out of their orbit. Yeah, I think I would have absolutely benefited from a community like Exaholics.
Would you say that you were an exaholic?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think when I look at the homepage of your website, I think that describes what I went through pretty much perfectly.
And would you say, as we often do, that if you put in the work and the effort, it will get better? Do you believe that most, if not all of us, have the ability to recover from this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's part of our programming too. You know, when you talk about you asked about the science of this, one of the really important things that happens, which is a absolute opportunity for anyone suffering from unrequited love or in the wake of a breakup, is that the part of our brains that solves problems, that assesses losses and gains, starts to work really hard when we're rejected in love. And that's an incredible opportunity. We're actually meant to figure out what went wrong and move on. You know, and at first it may feel like, we're figuring out what went wrong so that we can try to get back with the person. But then you can actually use it to think, okay, something went wrong. What can I do to help myself move forward? What can I do to understand my own mistakes and look at the world in a different way and support myself in a different way?